Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to run through some introductions and then we'll get started. You see, there's quite a few people still signing on, but in the interest of time, we'll get going. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Haley, and I work with CMI. And I'm joined here today by both Kendall Benesh and also Marcy Marr with the Kootenai Conservation Program, or KCP for short. CMI and KCP have joined forces again, as many of you know, and this year we're presenting the 9th season of CMI's CRED Talks, the Columbia Region Ecological Discussions, and KCP's 11th Winter Webinar Series. Now, before we dive in too deeply, I'd just like to first acknowledge that the region in which both of our organizations work is the unceded homeland of the Sinixt, the Shuswap, the Ktunaxa, and the Syilx Okanagan peoples, who have stewarded and cared for this land, water, and wildlife since time immemorial. And I'd like to invite all of you to provide your own land acknowledgement as well. So if you use the chat feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, please feel welcome to tell us whose Indigenous territories you're zooming in from. Feel welcome to tell us what sort of work you're involved in as well. Okay. So a little bit about this series. This season of webinars, we are exploring the theme of stewarding for biodiversity. We're welcoming 4 speakers who will be discussing the theme from different perspectives, emphasizing that conserving biological diversity and caring for all living things requires a variety of people, viewpoints, and practices. This series is financially supported by Ecoscape Environmental Consultants, LGL Limited, as well as KCP's program funders. So many thanks to those organizations for making this possible. For our 3rd webinar today, we're going to be welcoming Ryan Durand with EcoLogic Consultants to learn about his work with the Slocan Lake Stewardship Society in building a flexible conservation roadmap for the Bonanza Biodiversity Corridor, drawn from ecosystem mapping, rare species and habitat inventories, and landscape level assessments. And we'll be introducing Ryan in more detail in just a moment. So while I have you here, and while folks are introducing themselves in the chat, I'm going to take advantage and tell you just a little bit about CMI, who we are and what we do. We're a nonprofit organization and an association of people working in the various fields of ecology. We provide professional development opportunities that come in many forms, such as conferences, courses, webinars, of course, that address everything from field and data science research techniques to more complex land management conundrums. Our website is a great place to learn more about what we do and has many fantastic resources, such as proceeding documents and recordings from all of our major events. So you can find that at cmiae.org. And what I'd like to do now is pass it over to Marcy.
Great, thanks, Haley. Hi, everyone. My name is Marcy Marr, and I'm joining you on behalf of the Kootenai Conservation Program. And we're a broad partnership of more than 85 land and water conservation stewardship groups, First Nations, government agencies, and agricultural producers working throughout the East and West Kootenays. And the purpose of KCP's partnership is to cooperatively conserve the biodiversity and naturally functioning ecosystems of the region through land conservation and stewardship, and to generate the support and resources needed to advance this effort, which includes sharing technical knowledge and expertise through webinars like this one. We're excited to be co-hosting this webinar series again with CMI, and would like to give an additional thanks to our program sponsors, without whom we would not be able to support this type of work. So now I just have a few housekeeping details and then we'll get started. So this webinar is being recorded and will be posted within a week to both CMI's event webpage and KCP's Winter Webinar Series webpage. We'll have a Q&A at the end of Ryan's presentation. And please use the Q&A function in the Zoom toolbar, not the chat, in order to add a question, and we'll do our best to make our way through them and try to end on time at 1 p.m. Okay, back to you, Haley.
Hey, sounds great, thanks. So I have the pleasure of introducing Ryan Durand. I'm going to read this bio and then we'll pass it over to him. So Ryan Durand is an ecologist with over 20 years experience working throughout Western and Northern Canada. Ryan specializes in vegetation inventories, wetland ecosystem classification and mapping, and watercourse mapping and assessments. He's proficient in air photo interpretation and GIS mapping, having completed over 50 mapping projects encompassing over 8 million hectares, including terrestrial ecosystem mapping, predictive ecosystem mapping, sensitive ecosystem inventory mapping, and wildlife habitat suitability mapping. He also has considerable experience in BC with local government and other organizations, completing conservation planning, management planning, wetland and riparian restoration design, ecosystem mapping and classification training, and rare species research. So Ryan, thank you so much for making the time to be with us today. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you. See if I can share.
Looks
All right,
great.
hopefully that screen is sharing properly.
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And it's always fun giving bios for these things, and I obviously just copy it right from my resume. So sorry for the catch-all for a little bit of everything in the world. Yeah, my name is Ryan Durand, resident of the Slocan Valley, and I've had the wonderful fortune of working on this project for, well, related projects along with this one for the last almost 7 years now, which is pretty amazing. And then previous to this original one, working on other ones in the area. So this is kind of a accumulation of a whole bunch of knowledge and work we've done in the Slocan Valley for over 10 years now. So just a little bit of background. Marcy covered it already, but this is a project that's funded through the Kootenai Conservation Program with a whole bunch of different funders, and we're just internally grateful for our wonderful funders from Environment Canada and Columbia Basin Trust for enabling all this great work that's been done for many years. So the Biodiversity Conservation Corridor, stumbled that already, the Bonanza Biodiversity Corridor. The whole intent of this is really to not make a static plan, but really to collect information from as many different sources as we can and put it together in a format that we can use to help guide activities in the landscape that we're interested in. So instead of trying to have some kind of a static map and like draw polygons and say this area is this type of management zone, this area is this type, we realize that we don't really have a lot of influence of what actually happens in the landscape. So this is mostly, in the end, a communication tool, I guess, that just tries to combine everything we could possibly think of from this watershed, put it into a single product, and then when Slocan Lake Stewardship Society and other groups that work in the watershed talk to a specific stakeholder or other group in the watershed, they can use this information to really just portray the concerns they have, the values, identify where things are, make other people more knowledgeable and aware of what's really in there, and help them guide their own planning processes. So for instance, we were out last fall with one of the local forestry tenure holders, and we walked some of the areas that they're talking about doing some fuel reduction program. We had these mapping products, we have these reports with us, so we could say, these are all the values we know about. So when you go out there and make plans to do these kind of modifications, this is what we're aware of. So we expect you guys to also put not an equal amount of effort into, but be aware of all the values and put the appropriate level of effort into it to manage it properly. So this has been kind of summed up in this little infographic, I guess you would call it, that SLSS made up for the project, about just trying to encompass everything we could think of that goes into this one process. The actual words in the middle of the cube change as needed, but the idea is that we really are trying to cover as many different aspects as we can. So for people that don't know, and probably most don't, the Bonanza Biodiversity Corridor, or BBC as we'll be calling it, is a watershed that's located north of Slocan Lake in the Slocan Valley, the big star on the map, obviously. So north of Castlegar, south of Nakusp. Oops. And it's about a 13,000 hectare watershed that drains into Slocan Lake, and it's constrained by two large mountain ranges. Most of it starts up in Summit Lake and it drains down the Bonanza Creek, hence the name. And it's really quite a diverse little watershed, and probably more importantly for us is it's relatively intact still compared to a lot of accessible watersheds in southern BC. There's vast areas of it that just have not been disturbed excessively in recent years. So looking at from the south end of the lake, we have these amazing wetland complexes that go on the north end of Slocan Lake. Big, huge wetland complexes, really important. On the right hand side, you can see looking at the valley, some of the mountain ranges on the left. There's significant wetlands all through the lower elevations of it, and then we quickly go up into these steep mountainsides. Oops. And then the north end we get into Summit Lake, which is kind of the northern extent of our study area. So it's pretty much defined by water. A lot of the area is really small sub-watersheds within it. A lot of these sub-watersheds are snow driven or more ephemeral in nature. Most of them don't have a very large water flow. So it's a pretty small system. But the amazing thing is just over time how what we found, I guess, by just like really intensely studying this area to lay the foundation for what we were calling this conservation road plan. So to get into a little more detail, we started out really by looking at in the landscape kind of level through a variety of projects over the years. One was called Swamp, originally looking at wetlands, and then we moved on to doing actual terrestrial ecosystem mapping of the whole watershed. So for each one of these biogeoclimatic ecosystem zones within the watershed, we used a combination of LiDAR terrain mapping and ecosystem mapping to actually tease out all the different ecosystem units within it and really create a foundational map that we could draw everything on it. So once we have these foundational maps made, we can start looking at things like where's yield growth, where's the disturbed areas, where are the wetlands, the sparse habitats, all the different sensitive features that we're interested in the landscape. So my line of work, this is kind of our normal baseline thing we do right away at the beginning of any project. We go out there, we start mapping, we try to get an understanding of what's there across the whole landscape, and then we start looking more at the details. And the details are where this project gets really fun. So over a series of years, mostly two of us, Tyson Ehlers and myself, spent an inordinate amount of time wandering around the hillsides in this watershed, poking under every log we could find, just exploring everything. And we looked for the smallest things and we looked for the biggest things. And in the end, between the fieldwork we did and all the existing data that we could find in the watershed, including citizen science, past studies, other researchers, there was over 1,400 different taxa described for this one little watershed. If you look at the list on the left, there's areas that we did really detailed assessments on. There's other ones that were quite sparsely or very just touched upon, like lichens. There's hundreds, if not 1,000, probably lichens in the watershed, but it's not our expertise. But the amazing thing is that if you spend enough time in these kind of landscapes and really delve into it, you start finding all kinds of amazing little critters everywhere, and the results get pretty astounding. So part of this included just being in the field, doing field surveys every season. We also use a variety of camera traps to capture some of the larger wildlife all through the area. Hired additional biologists and other consultants to go do work like on amphibians and other fun stuff, and really just tried to figure out everything that we possibly could from in there. The amazing thing of all this is that in this one little, again, 13,000 hectare watershed, there's been now 49 species at risk identified in there. This number might have changed a little bit with the conservation values changing over the last couple of years, but the result is kind of the same. There's a huge amount of rare species in one little watershed. And as much as we like to say that this is like because the Bonanza corridor is the most amazing place in the world, it's more a reflection of just the time that's put into it. Like we had the luxury of this funding program to really spend a huge amount of time on the landscape and really get in there and learn what was there. And these are the kind of results that you get when you have that time to actually do it properly. The probably even more fascinating thing is that we also found numerous species that were the first records for BC, Canada, or North America. It's kind of a subset of Tyson and I's research that we like little things that no other people look at. So we find all kinds of novel species. But all these rare species are right across the board. They mostly focus on the lower elevations and the wetlands and the riverine systems. But as you see, as you go through the next maps, they're everything from large ungulates to lots of birds, reptiles, fungi, plants, the works. Oops. So a whole bunch of maps. I like making maps. So we made maps of all the data that we could find of actual or reliable sources of confirmed locations for at-risk species. And these are just to kind of give you a rough idea of the distribution. In this area, we also have things such as the whitebark pine critical habitat and farther on mountain caribou critical habitat areas. So we overlaid that data as well into it. One quite special feature in the Bonanza corridor is Summit Lake. And Summit Lake has a very well studied western toad population and just this massive migration that literally makes the highway slick with little tiny toadlets every year until they put some protection up to reduce the mortality. So you see this incredible amount of data around Summit Lake just showing all these occurrences of western toads and the management area that they've made from that, just reflecting where those toads migrate out to and mature and then come back to Summit Lake to breed. Birds, we also have some really well-established bird biologists up in the north end of the valley that have spent decades researching birds. We have excellent data of all the use in the two main areas in Summit Lake and the north of Silcan Lake, and then sparse data for the rest of the area. Mammals, fish, insects. You can have rare insects in the area. A little bit of everything you can think of. Mollusks. So we got right down again, right into the forest floor and started looking at all the little critters. And they're actually one of the more underlooked but more common listed species throughout the Kootenay Columbia watershed. Really, it's all these little tiny mollusks that live in the forest floor. So we're actually able to find a whole bunch of them, and that probably vastly underestimates the number that are actually there. In addition to the common ones, there's all kinds of interesting little ones that are not common, such as the Harrington finger clan that's only been found in a couple places in all of BC, or these jumping slugs that we found up in the mountains in the subalpine. They're all very photogenic, especially the little tiny things. And just to give you an idea of, again, if you delve down into the small organisms, the amazing biodiversity you can find. Excuse me. So there's an example of a bunch of the mollusks or gastropods that were found in the watershed, including a bunch of rare ones. And on the right, one of our specialties is looking at something called slime molds or myxomycetes, which are these little tiny fungal-like organisms that occur in the area. And because no one else has studied them, we found all kinds of first occurrences, as I was saying, for BC, Canada, and sometimes North America in there. So we have all these recorded observations in the BBC that this is the first time they've ever been found in our neck of the woods, which is really exciting all the time. So going back into the larger scale, back to the landscape kind of level, as part of the terrestrial ecosystem mapping process, we classify every single wetland or every single ecosystem type that we can in the whole watershed. And so that data can be used to actually tease out the sensitive ecosystems and the at-risk ecosystems. And these are normally as with most studies, these end up being the things like wetlands and floodplains, our old forests, our sparse and brushland ecosystems, and other ones that we just know are either have very high biodiversity and ecosystem function values or are very susceptible to any kind of disturbance. So by doing the ecosystem mapping, we can figure out what's actually there in terms of what we think is there and what also might be there in areas that we have not had a chance to actually get up to and check in person. But the result was that we found a large number of sensitive ecosystems in our area, pretty much all wetlands and floodplains. And that's really just something that's relative to the landscape that we're working in. There isn't a lot of data in these interior temperate areas that to really do conservation assessments on a lot of the ecosystem types. So a lot of them are really focused on wetlands. The Bonanza corridor has an amazing wetland diversity and complex, including a whole bunch of oddball fens and swamps that don't really fit into the provincial system, and just a really nice range in general of wetland types. I don't think I'd say much more about that other than that if you look at some of these really oddball ones, like this FM51, this is something that's only supposed to occur in coastal BC. Yeah, it's something that we found randomly up in the middle of the Bonanza corridor. So it's some people may not be aware, but the whole interior wet belt in this area has a lot of coastal disjuncts in it. So even though it's well away from the coast, we have a lot of things that are similar to the coastal forests in BC. We got yellow cedar in some places up in the Slocan Valley. We got things like salal and gnome plant and all these coastal species. So it's not surprising that we're even seeing entire ecosystem types in here, but it is really interesting to find them. Just to give you a little picture of the diversity of what we're looking at, so all the way from the lake margins to swamps to really nice marshes. And what's not shown here is the fens or the higher elevation stuff, but just emphasizing that the habitat types and the diversity of ecosystems is really high. So after we have looked at those on the mapping and ground truth them, we start to put all these onto individual maps. So if you're not kind of aware of where I'm going yet, the whole idea is that we looked at this whole watershed from a landscape level, from a insect and little critters under the log level, and then we're trying to put it all onto maps and make sense of it and make some kind of a workable product that we can help guide the conversation in the future. So as I go through this and talking about the rare species, the ecosystems, it's all individual maps illustrating those, and then you'll see at the end how they all start layering together into one final product. So just an idea of all the red and blue listeds or rare ecosystem communities in this watershed. All the ones we know about, lower elevation. It's probably pretty accurate and comprehensive, but chances are in the higher elevations and areas that are just simply not accessible to us for the most part, there might be some more outliers up there. But for the most part, like most areas in interior, at least BC, most of our rare or listed ecosystems end up being in lower elevation areas. We of course are always interested in water being one of the most important things for biodiversity and ecosystem function in general. So part of the process was actually trying to think about our riparian systems, about buffering them, about trying to think about the actual effective riparian zones to get some idea of what's there. Unfortunately, we don't have the kind of really detailed map of what is out there for as far as watercourses. So we're just stuck with using all the provincial data sets, which have interesting areas at times, but generally give you a pretty good idea of what's on the landscape. So this map's just showing all the various watercourses with, I believe, a 30-meter buffer on them to illustrate what a more or less effective riparian zone would be around them. And then the various riparian and wetland communities that are mostly in the lowlands around there. Forests, obviously forests is high on everyone's list of values and interests in the landscape, and the Bonanza corridor is no different. It has a pretty good amount of remnant old growth forests throughout the whole watershed. Not a lot at lower elevations. Most of them are higher up. Most of the lower elevation ones were either logged or burned a long time ago. But there are all these wonderful little remnant old forests at lower elevation. A lot of the area in this watershed was logged in the early turn of the century, the early 1900s. So you actually see still the remnants of the old springboard stumps showing that old logging influence. And then if we put on a map, as I was saying, most of the time these older forests are up high out of the area in areas that is much harder to log, whereas the lower elevation stuff is much rarer. Compounding that, like most other places in BC, is we have an incredible history of fire. And if you start overlaying fire and past disturbances on top of these maps, you'll start quickly seeing that they often correspond quite well to each other. So these areas that burned off in these huge uncontrolled fires a long time ago, you see very little old growth left of them just because they simply burned away. And if you do see old growth patches left from those big old burns, it's often associated with little ravines and wet spots and other little refugia where they survived it. But it quite closely correlates with that fire history in this landscape. So moving on to other values from that sensitive ecosystem list in the beginning there is our sparser habitats, our subalpine to almost a little bit alpine habitat. We don't technically have alpine in the watershed, but there's some little areas right up on the top of the mountains that are very, very close to having a little bit of alpine heath communities. Lots of avalanche paths, both herbaceous, shrub, and treed ones that are really important for grizzly bears and other values. Talus slopes, rock outcrops. So all of these things we tried to map out and determine where they were. Majority of our sparser habitats are the ones that have very shallow soils, very easily impacted by any kind of disturbance. So mapping them out and trying to figure out where they are was important to us. On the map, showing the combination of those, so our sparser habitats. Most of that again would be talus, rock outcrops, cliffs, that kind of thing. Our brushland ecosystems. So this one is in some ways a little bit of a stretch because we couldn't get up there, but our brushland ecosystems are those ones that are naturally dominated by shrubs. So a lot of the areas in our landscape anyway, they're normally really hot, exposed area, shallow soils, where you just don't have conditions that are favorable to any kind of tree or significant tree cover. So they end up being dominated by shrubs in the long run. They closely correspond with all the rock outcrops and the sparsely vegetated areas as well. So not a lot of them, but there's some pretty significant ones in some of the rockier areas in the watershed. And then our alpine / subalpine landscape, where we expect to see them up high. Avalanches. As we said again, there's a lot of avalanche slope. It's a very steep area, so there's a lot of potential for avalanches to exist. So we have lots of interesting avalanche communities throughout the whole area. And I didn't put the map in here, but there's a really interesting map that Michael Proctor made of this valley, showing where the main wildlife corridors are through here, and based on all of his lifetime of experience of looking at grizzly bear habitat and tracking them and watching their migration stuff. And you can see all the corridors that he plots through here for grizzlies are basically right to the middle here for all these avalanche paths are. So there's, I mean, we know grizzlies like avalanches in general, and it just really shows that they're so important for that kind of cross corridor connectivity is right through our avalanche slopes. And this also corresponds with the areas that's least disturbed. Imagine that. Another interesting thing in the Bonanza area is there's a very strong calcium influence in the south end. We actually have a few little watercourses that have what's known as a tufa formation. So that kind of stepped look of a calcium or a stream that flows over an area that's very rich in calcium. So you actually get accumulations of the calcium so much that it makes that step like little pools going down the creeks. And for any plant people on here, we always get excited whenever we hear about calcium deposits because it pretty much always means rare plants. So we're always looking for anything calcium related. And there's a number of them on the lower end of the watershed. So the next thing we wanted to put on our maps is really get an idea of disturbance. So as I said before, there was a lot of large fires about 75 to 100 years ago that took out large parts of the watershed. And as much as we all think fire is a disturbance to everything else, in this watershed, it's probably in some ways one of the saving graces. If you look back on the previous maps of where a lot of the contiguous forest is, it really lines up with all this big fires on the east or the north and east side of the valley because it was recent enough and intense enough that it pretty much burned everything right back. And as a result, in my mind, there just wasn't a lot of logging opportunities there since then. It's not fully recovered. So it was a major disturbance in the past, but at the same time, it's almost given that half of the watershed a bit of a reprieve that there's not been much there to really disturb since. It's slowly starting to come back. They're starting to do more logging in the lower elevations, but the upper part really is pretty intact. On the south and the west side, the fires, I guess, maybe weren't as intense or they were older, and you're starting to see a lot more logging activity coming back in here. Since this map has been made, there's been additional logging, and they're proposing to do a bunch more blocks in the middle, in the kind of untouched area. Just an example of the disturbances. I think we all know what they are. One of the interesting things about the Bonanza corridor as well is there's actually an old railway that goes the full length of it, all the way from Slocan Lake to Nakusp. And this railway now a really well-used recreational corridor, also has changed large parts of the valley. It's kind of ended up being effectively a bit of a dike along parts of Bonanza Creek that's cut off the creek and really reduced that natural flow and erosion processes and habitat subsequently along the creek. So there's a very long linear disturbance right along the middle of the main creek going through the whole valley that has both been just made disturbance, but also made lots of opportunities for restoration and recreation and other stuff. So that was a very quick kind of overview of a whole bunch of different things that took us years and years to do. So our real challenge after all of this was, like we all face in the conservation world, is we have all this data. What the heck do we do with it? And how can we use it so it's actually useful? What can you do with it so it's not just another map that gets put in a report and puts on a shelf and nobody ever looks at again? So we tried to make, as I was saying in the beginning, a map that is not one that makes zones and regions and says, thou shalt protect this site. We just want to illustrate all the different values on there to use it more as a way to communicate, a way to express our thoughts on where the most important areas are in the watershed. So when future disturbance, development, etc., does happen, and it will, there's no illusion that's not going to, we have some kind of a basis to frame that discussion, to help influence that discussion. So we use all of the at-risk and sensitive areas that were described and basically called them high-value conservation areas. So that was all of our rivers, our floodplains, the old-growth forests, sparsely vegetated areas, the alpine, subalpine, avalanche areas. For the most part, made those one kind of polygon on the map and just said these are our highest conservation areas. There's some natural things that are done more at the federal level. We proposed critical habitat for caribou and whitebark pine. Whitebark pine is actually really common all along the alpine and subalpine areas along these mountains. Basically, every ridgetop is covered in them, of various qualities and health, but they are really quite common. Whereas the very large critical habitat for mountain caribou that extends across the entire north and eastern side of the watershed probably has less value these days, since I don't believe there's any caribou actually left there. But the point being that there is a future area if they can get caribou recovery happening, this is where they will live in the future. The habitat's there. As we mentioned before, the Summit Lake Western Toad Management Area, so that buffered area with all that really good long-term data around Summit Lake, showing where this large population of Western toads breed and live throughout the year. And then all the various species of risk. So we didn't really worry about birds and animals, or mammals, I mean, because they move so much that you can't really put a point on the map and say this is something you need to manage for, because chances are not there anymore. To manage for them, we really need to think more just about habitat quality and abundance in general. That if you have it, they hopefully will use it kind of approach. Whereas for the little stuff, like the plants, the fungi, reptiles to some degree, mollusks, most of them have relatively small home ranges. So if we do find them in a specific part on the watershed, chances are they're not going to go very far. So we made a series of just buffers around those points, saying within these areas, we know they're used by these various rare species. Chances are if we found one of them in that spot, there's probably a larger population, there's probably a few more. So in abundance of caution, here's what we would call a management zone to say, these are known rare species areas, and if you do something here, let's be aware of it. Let's go do more field surveys for those before we disturb it. I think I talked about riparian zone already, but just to make it simple, because we didn't have any kind of detailed data to pull from to make it more accurate, just made a 30-meter buffer along all the watercourses, just to show these are approximate riparian areas. And then mature forests. To me, mature forests is the ones that often get overlooked in these kind of processes because they're not old, they're not floodplain, they're not whatever else. But really, if we keep making or focusing our disturbance, such as logging on all the mature forests, then we don't have old growth of the future. So identifying where those areas are and trying to make sure we include some of those and thinking about conservation is as important as old growth to me in many ways, because If we lose it, it's going to take a long time to get back, if we ever get it back. So for the grand finale of trying to put it all together, we made a map. Woohoo! So yeah, a big, huge, messy map that tried to illustrate all these different values. For anyone who's tried to make a GIS map before and actually clearly show anything like this on it, you kind of understand that it always looks super messy and a whole smorgasbord of stuff. But again, the idea is really this is a communication tool. We want to show that if someone is interested in going out in this landscape and doing X activity, that these are the values that we know are there. These are the values that we think that they should be investigating and putting time into doing surveys pre-development to actually make sure they fully capture what's there before they do something. So as an example of that, with SLSS, we walked some areas in the bottom of this map down by Slocan Lake with a forestry tenure holder where they were talking about doing fuel management prescriptions down there. So really good project, a lot of benefits to the community, but until you actually go walk out in the land and really show them all this stuff, it's quite surprising the reaction. So and just helping the forester learn that it's not just trees, it's, as we walked in the forest, we were talking about pine mushroom habitat, and we found a rare snail for them to look at. We found a moist old growth forest in the middle of their fuel management zone. So finding all these little things that we know exist in the watershed, pointing them out to something like that who's actually making the decisions on the ground, really just kind of gives us that ability to help influence it, hopefully, in a small way. I mean, in a perfect world, or I anyway, would love to draw some big polygons on here and say these are the most important areas and they should never be touched. But the reality is we don't have that influence or that power in any way. So by just trying to make communication tools that can show what's out there is kind of our next best step. And so just bringing it back in kind of a full circle, that's why Wendy at the Slocan Lake Stewardship Society came up with this concept in the beginning of just trying to really show that we want to identify as many different things as we can in the landscape. And then as different activities show up, let's talk about it. We've identified all the values. So now when people come to do this or that, these are the values. We want you to respect them and we want you to put effort into maintaining it for what we know is there. And just to finish up here, this is just one of the projects we did. So I said we were working in this area for several years, and we continue to work on the same funding in the south end of the project now. But we also did a bunch of work in the Bonanza Biodiversity Corridor on restoration. We did some wetland enhancement projects, 2 riparian restoration areas. We did a bunch of work looking at beavers, trying to map out all the beavers and do beaver habitat assessment, understand where they are, and a lot of other projects. And you can see in the acknowledgement areas that this by no means was me doing this. This was a whole bunch of people, different consultants, worked with the Okanagan Nation Alliance and a variety of parts of this, and everyone else you can think of had input on it. So thank you to them all. I think that's my 40 minutes.
Well, thanks so much. Really appreciate it, Ryan. It's so good to have all this presented and to have it rolled up so we can see what's going on in the landscape and know so much. And I see some people on the call from our area here in our watershed, and this level of information is really important. And yeah, you and Tyson have done a great job of getting down on your hands and knees and getting under logs and everything else you've done from this bird's eye view of mapping to all the field inventory. So thanks. Thanks for all that you've done. And so I am going to now get into some questions. And for those who've done this before, you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, there's an opportunity to upvote. And so that means if somebody has asked a question that would be similar to yours or that you think is a really good one, you'd love to know the answer, please give the little thumbs up, upvote. You'll see the little thumbs up icon there. Sorry, lower left. My screen is something different. Yeah, just give a little upvote and that'll help me prioritize as we go through some of these questions for Ryan. So the first question is, someone back early in your presentation was interested in where you obtained the data for your figure, which was 7.41, and it was the figure that focused on fire and old growth.
So the fire is provincial mapping. So the provincial like spatial data warehouse, and they call it these days. They have layers of all the fires with dates going back to the early 1900s anyway, updated every single year. That's just simply polygons from that. And I don't recall in that old growth if it's the one that we pulled out from the terrestrial ecosystem mapping or is modeled from the vegetation resource inventory mapping. I assume it was our TEM data. So that would have been our mapping data. So just overlaid the two.
Okay, and another next question is someone saying, great project. Have you worked to overlay cultural values with this work you've done? And she understands you might not be able to share this information, just curious how it would fit in.
We did not. And really because to date, I don't think we know, or that information has not been shared with us at least, of a knowledge holder in this watershed that really has that local knowledge to help inform it. So it's something that we definitely talked to the ONA and other nation partners over the years. But to date, we have not found a knowledge keeper that's I'm not sure if the right word is willing to, or is comfortable, or maybe they just don't have the information in this area. So currently, no. It'd be a wonderful layer to add.
Yeah. Okay, and Kevin Bolifers said, thanks for your talk, Ryan. Do you think you could take your database and incorporate citizen science to add other discoveries as they're made? And how would you confirm or approve those findings?
I
Oh,
almost put that slide
opens
in.
up a good one for you, right?
Almost put that slide in. So that's one of myself and Tyson's passions. So we have our naturalist projects for the Bonanza area and the whole Silicon watershed. Our larger one for the Silicon watershed has, maybe Tyson can correct me, he's on here, somewhere around 4,000 species on it now probably, and pushing 150, 160 rare species on it. So the iNaturalist in particular data we use constantly on every project. And as far as the verification thing, really it's mostly on the two of us going through and trying to confirm everything we can. So it's citizen science is never 100%, but Tyson in his amazing analytical mind with data sets normally goes through all these big sets of citizen science and helps tease out which ones are realistic and which ones need additional information and which ones he's just more comfortable leaving at just the genus level, saying that we know it's something different, but we don't really know what it is.
Yeah, and with SLSS too, the iNaturalist program has been something just to help generate interest in people getting out there and uploading. So it doesn't need to be all the small and rares and amazing stuff that Ryan and Tyson have found, but there's lots of people who've been just adding sightings just to have those locations and begin to contribute to the naturalist information we have. Hey, so here's another question. Can this area become an ecologically designated KBA or key biodiversity area?
As I understand it, no. We had a discussion with them a few years ago, and their criteria is actually quite high. So I believe their criteria is they need to have X% of like the known breeding population, for instance, of Western toads. So I don't think we've identified any value where we can say it to that level that it would qualify. But that was a discussion we had a few years ago, so maybe it's changed since then. And that's what I was trying to illustrate, attempting to illustrate before, that yes, the Bonanza Biodiversity Corridor is amazing and has phenomenal values in it, but so do most watersheds in BC. If you spent this much time and had the luxury of wandering around through all these mountains and really collecting stuff in detail, we would probably find similar values in almost any intact watershed in BC. It's just we've not done the work. There's so little data throughout our province of what actually exists there that you just need the time to spend actually looking, and you'll start generating lists like this almost anywhere.
Yeah. Well, and I think you really captured the topographic sort of complexity too, in how you guys were doing your field work by going all over the place. But yeah. Okay, another question here is when you began to view the different layers together on the maps, what relationships became most evident? For example, species distribution correlated with fire or forest age or other values.
So we didn't, or we don't have species distribution data enough to do much with it. These are really just kind of reconnaissance snapshot surveys of what we find hiking out there. It's not the kind of data where you could really quantify that level. The big one, I guess, is really just is fires and disturbance in general. So it's pretty obvious looking at the mature and old growth forests for sure, for certain, that the fires excluded some areas where they were lighter burns, you have older trees. And then also, as I was saying before, those areas that had older large burns where they just haven't had enough time to recover, may never recover, you have less disturbance on them because there's nothing to disturb so far. It's going to happen at some point, but currently it's not there. So I think with the level of data, even though it seemed like we have a huge amount of stuff, we don't have that kind of granular stuff that you can really plot distribution, for instance. It's more just a snapshot of what's there.
Okay, and Andrea Kerr has another question, and this one will make you happy. Were there any species found during field investigations that weren't expected or caused the most excitement when you found it?
Start. So many. So I mean, Tyson and I have a wonderful job of crawling around and finding cool little things. And so I mean, I wish I knew the number. We probably found 20 plus species, maybe even 30 species, mostly of slime molds and fungi that were new to BC, new to the province, new for Canada, or sometimes North America. So every time we found one of those, obviously that was just amazing. And other times it was just simple little things like seeing a marten in the forest, or that, I can't remember the name of it, that weird jumping mouse. Like things like that you think should be well known for the area, but when you start looking at the databases and find they're just not there. Or that little Harrington's finger clam again, like that one had not been found for almost 100 years, and I found it in the Columbia River 7 or 8 years ago for another Ktunaxa project. That'd be one of the first times it had been found in 100 years. Then we found it again over here, and now we're kind of finding them all over the place. So things that are supposedly quite rare and unknown is quite often, when they're small things anyway, just because nobody's looked, nobody's put the effort into trying to find them. And it's amazing once you clue into that whole different world, how many more things you find and how common some of them end up being.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I remember going out with you in that one fen that we were at, and there were black spruce and Labrador tea and two kinds of cotton grass and two kinds of sundews, and like it was just popping into the woods to go see what we could find in the forest, and coming across that gem.
And that was
Yeah,
like 5 minutes off the highway.
yeah,
You've driven
exactly.
by here for the last 20 years and never noticed it was there until you went and looked, right?
Exactly, yeah. Couldn't keep out of there. Call it the phenomenal fen. Okay, let's see. So, yeah, so someone's wondering, with all the time that you and Tyson and all were out there, how much, how would you quantify it? How much time would you say you spent on the ground doing this kind of species inventory work?
That's not a question I can answer. If you
Yeah.
knew the two of us better, you'd realize that work and hobby is the same thing. So there was the paid days, which were maybe a week a year or something, maybe 2 weeks at the most through these grants. And then there was every time we drove by, we stop and look. Every weekend we can go for a hike, we go hiking and camp and find more. So it's I have no idea. In a nutshell. Basically, wherever we go, we record species constantly and look and always looking for more. So it's a more
Yeah.
lifeline pursuit than a job.
Yeah, and I think you made the point early on, like so much got started, even 7, 8 years ago with Swamp and the Slocan Wetlands Assessment and Monitoring project, and it just sort of we kept building and building. And then with the Kootenai Connect funding the last 6, 7 years, you guys have been really able to be out there. So You know, as Ryan
Yeah.
said before, it's great to have the effort, but it's also really nice to have the funding and just sort of support to then help make sense of, you know, all the cool finds that get made.
And then there's so many more we can't take any credit whatsoever for. Like all that bird data is Gary Davidson's lifetime data of birding in the marshes in there. And so there's so much that way more beyond just the two of us looking. Like we found cool things for sure, but there was so much more that was from existing data sources from many other people.
Yeah. Yeah, so here's a comment from Douglas Cook. Massive thanks, Ryan, for you and others' rich and quality work for this watershed. If we combine the wisdom that such detailed work can enlighten with the precautionary principle, should we demand the end of short rotation corporate industrial fiber mining till all the watersheds are assessed for these entangled webs?
What can I say about yes, in my opinion? That would be a dream. It's never going to happen, obviously. But I think these kind of processes can be replicated in many ways, even in a smaller example of it, and really provide really valuable information that can influence what's going on.
Yes.
And then we mentioned like citizen science a while ago, like what iNaturalist has done for the data availability across the world really is phenomenal. So almost every project that we work on now, and we do the same kind of work all over Canada, one of the first things that we do often is go to places like iNaturalist and eBird and other repositories and go, okay, well, what do we already know? And it's amazing how comprehensive some of these things are and how valuable those data sets are. So just by having all of us out there recording and looking and trying to find new things, we make those little bits of data source that can be used in many, many ways. And you're starting to see a lot of like I can't remember which nation I saw it in, but one of the First Nations we're working with right now in northern BC, I believe in some of their management guidelines they're putting out, they're starting to even say like forestry tenure holders or mining companies, when you do your pre-work in this area, we want you to actually look at not just the conservation data center, for instance, but we want you to actually look at citizen science. They even start naming iNaturalists and saying we want you to actually look at these first. And when you see those species in the landscape, we want you to actually address them. So the citizen science kind of movement is really powerful.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. And the combination too with Indigenous knowledge and other sorts of local and yeah, knowledge holders. So probably this will be the last question here, Ryan. So can you briefly comment on how you update the BC provincial records with all of the species information that you've collected and anything else?
So we don't specifically. I've noticed that the conservation data center now seems to data mine things again like iNaturalist lately and actually ask questions and use that data. For the more interesting stuff, all the fungi and the slime mold stuff, Tyson actually has a contract right now with the CDC, I believe, to actually go through it all and redo all the conservation ranks for the area, so that knowledge is all getting in there. And really, I mean, we said this before at a Slocan Lake Stewardship Society meeting a while ago, saying that one of the unintended results of this project and the time really was this whole fascination the two of us has developed in slime molds, of all things. And it's gone from something that was very unknown in the province to 2 years ago, all of a sudden they're listed in the Conservation Data Center and they have ranks on it, to now we have national ranks across all of Canada, and they're actually getting on the red and blue list. So when I'm doing larger projects like impact assessments and environmental assessments for mines and transportation corridors and all the big industrial projects, we're now actually putting fungi in, we're putting slime molds in, we're putting all these little obscure things in it, because as soon as it gets listed in the conservation data center as being a at-risk species in our province, in my mind, all of a sudden it's fair game, and we start using these in many ways that you wouldn't expect. So in some ways that was a direct result of this work, was having the luxury of time to explore and follow our passions, and we found some really cool things that are making a little tiny difference.
Yeah, well, it's fabulous work and just really appreciate it. I think all of us have learned so much over the years for what you've been finding, and this packaging of all the information will really help us all out locally. So just want to tell you thanks very much. And Haley, over to you. Close us out.
Great. Thanks so much, Marcy. I'm just sharing a new slide here. Okay. Thank you very much, Ryan, again, for your time, for Tyson, for everybody involved in that massive, very detailed, very valuable project that I can see in the comments is inspiring to many. Thanks also to all of our funders, of course, who are making this mini project possible. And I just wanted to do another little plug for the recordings. We've been pretty quick getting those recordings up. So if you want to see any others in the past series, or of course this one, and share it with folks who weren't able to make it here today, those recordings will be up on both the KCP and the CMI websites really soon. And I wanted to plug the next talk, which will come up in 2 weeks, which is going to be really thought-provoking and interesting, and have lots of neat applications for our area, even though it doesn't directly take place in our area. And that talk will be with Janaki Biachara, and the title of that is Code Switch, Translating Stewardship Practice Across Cultures. So really looking forward to that one, and that'll be the final talk in this series this year. So thanks everyone for your time. Have a really wonderful day, and we'll reconnect in a couple weeks. I'm gonna leave the chat open for a moment, so you can send your kudos to Ryan there, and then we'll shut it down. Thanks, everybody.
And also, I think Haley posted in the chat here, if anyone wants to read more about this, that link that's on there is to the full report. And it's a very long report that details how every one of these maps is made and lists all the values in detail. So it's all there.
Great. Thanks everyone for attending. Have a great day.